Hey guys, how we doing? All right, so I'm creating this presentation. This is going to be the first part of Unit 1. Well, I guess this is part 2 technically. I'm in the Google Slides, the AP Government Ultimate Review Special COVID Edition. I'm on slide 23 right now if you want to follow along. I'm going to hit present. And perfect. Awesome. Okay, cool. Sorry, setting up my microphone. Okay, cool. So let's see. Basically, Unit 1 is all the foundations of democracy. And essential questions. How did the founders of the U.S. Constitution intend to protect individual liberty while also promoting public order and safety? So this is, all these essential questions are very broad overviews of like the material that we cover. So like how, for example, like gun ownership. Should the government be allowed to restrict gun ownership in the name of public safety? Or is it more important to have your individual liberties? Or what about your individual safety around that too as well? So just basically around, what laws are okay and what laws are maybe too restrictive that we don't think are necessary for safety, and just basically restrict our liberties and stuff like that. How have theory, debate, and compromise influenced the constitutional system? So for this one, guys, it's basically, the compromises I would focus on is basically understanding the differences of the states, their diversity of interests economically, their diversity of interests as far as geographically. And so for that one, I would just make sure that I know the compromises and understand what they are and understand the purpose and the reasoning behind each of those. And then how does the development and interpretation of the Constitution influence policies that impact citizens and residents of the U.S.? Really for that one, everything that is in the Constitution impacts us, and the changes that we've made to them, the changes around voting rights, the changes around, women's rights and all that kinds of stuff. All are, examples of just how policy changes have impacted our lives and impacted our society. Okay, so I'm going to read through this curriculum, but I will break at some certain points and I'll jump in to just kind of share my thoughts around this, but I will read directly from the AP curriculum. So the U.S. Constitution arose out of important historical and philosophical ideas and preferences regarding popular sovereignty and limited government. So let's remember, popular sovereignty is basically the we the people, that the ultimate power comes from us, the people. And then limited government is basically the idea that we will put limits on the government and government doesn't have total power, that we're going to put restrictions on what kind of laws they can pass, restrictions on what power the federal government has, what power the state government has. Compromises were made during the Constitutional Convention and ratification debates. And these compromises have frequently been the source of conflict in U.S. politics over the proper balance between individual freedom, social order, and equality of opportunity. These are kind of things that liberals and conservatives fight over, right? How free should we be? What laws are too restrictive? What laws we would say are okay? And then should the government work to provide opportunity, like tax the rich more and provide more opportunities for the needy and stuff like that? All sorts of, people have different opinions on all of this, but that's basically what that debate is centered around. The first semblance of a national government created after independence was a state-centered, decentralized system that reflected a fear of powerful central government. Yet the lack of powers held by the weak National Congress, coupled with each state's independent and often conflicting actions, raised concerns with such key actors as James Madison and Alexander Hamilton as to whether the Articles of Confederation were able to protect the new nation. So yeah, for that, basically, it's just saying that, there were concerns because the central government was too weak. Especially Shays' Rebellion. They don't mention that specifically in here, but they do in the curriculum later on. And so basically them saying, you've got weak Congress and states that are fighting with each other. And so that's going to lead to problems. And so we should probably, create a better system for that. The weaknesses led to a call for change and a decision to host a convention to revise the articles. So important to remember that originally they were sent up to Philadelphia not to write a new constitution, but to revise the Articles of Confederation and fix that system. Once they got there, though, they realized, this is not so good. We should just create a new system. So the convention itself was a triumph of negotiation, collaboration, and compromise, extending beyond the delegates' original mandate. It led to the creation of a new constitution that granted more centralized authority while dispersing powers among three branches in a national government and reserving powers and authority to the states to govern within their borders. So for that, basically just saying, the understanding that like basically they created a system where they have three branches, so they separated power. Also that they put the system of federalism in where you got the state power and the federal authority basically, and that they each are going to have their own little areas of protection and importance and that kinds of stuff. The group that favored the new federal constitution, the Federalists, argued that the constitutional separation of powers and checks and balances would protect people from governmental tyranny and unify the nation. The Federalists also argued that the Constitution lacked specific listing of rights. It protected civil liberties in general by limiting the national government to powers that were enumerated. So basically, the Federalists are like, look, we got this system, it's perfect, it's got separation of powers, it's got checks and balances, that's going to protect us from tyranny, and it's going to unite the nation. They said, yeah, we don't have a Bill of Rights, but we don't need it because the government's going to be so weak that it's not going to be a problem, and the states will still be pretty powerful. Plus, they were like, don't worry about the states are going to protect people's rights, so it's fine. But the Anti-Federalists didn't feel that way. So by contrast, the Anti-Federalists argued against a new federal system, claiming the new constitution would erode the sovereignty of the states, the prominence of local self-government, and their inherited liberties, as it lacked specific listing of rights needed to protect the people from national government. So basically they said, hey, you don't have a Bill of Rights in here, and that's very concerning. We are very concerned in general about giving up authority to a national government. And now we're not going to have protections of specific rights, like our right to own weapons and our right to speak out against the government, that kind of stuff. So they were like, that's a problem. We just went through the revolution and the problems around the old government. So this is it was concerning to them. And so Madison basically said, okay, fine, we'll put in a Bill of Rights, but after. Please ratify this first, and then we'll put in a Bill of Rights. So the Federalists, after James Madison's eventual concurrence, promised the Anti-Federalists that they would support on condition of Bill of Rights once the Constitution was ratified. The Constitution was ratified in 1788, although the last state of Rhode Island did not ratify until 1790. The Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, was ratified in 1791. Okay, more than 200 years later, the compromises that were necessary for the Constitution's ratification and in some instances led to ambiguity continue to fuel debate and sometimes even conflict over how best to protect liberty, equality, order, and private property. They did their best to create a system that is still working today, so we have to give them credit for that. But definitely they made some stuff ambiguous because they didn't know how to deal with it. Other stuff because they was like, then it can change and it can evolve with time and that kinds of stuff. But there's of course lots of debates, and you take a conservative and liberal, even those that even ones that understand the Constitution and constitutional scholars that have different ideologies, and they will debate about what the Constitution means and all that kinds of stuff, right? So these are literal experts, and they'll still say, I think it says this, or I think it says that. And that still happens to this day. And that's healthy. It's okay that we don't all agree on the Constitution, and it's okay that we have different debates around it and all that kinds of stuff. So that's still happening, obviously, today. Okay, Unit 1, Enduring Understanding. These enduring understandings, guys, I would say these are really crucial for you to go back and look at just so you can go, okay, do I have an enduring understanding? That's why they're called that. But if you're like, I just don't even understand that, or what, that's a big thing that you want to go, that's a red flag. Like, let me hit Ms. Foster up and just ask her if she could just explain what that means. So the enduring understanding is a balance between governmental power and individual rights, has been a hallmark of American political development. So I have like a balancing act there, as you can see in the visual, because it's a fine line that the government walks and that we walk as well. How many rights should we have? And when is it okay for the government to say, you can't do that? Right now, the government is saying I should stay at home. I'm okay with that because I understand the public health threat to myself and other people. So I'm okay with giving up some of my rights right now and staying at home if I think it's best for public safety and that kind of stuff. Or if you think about what, factories did in World War II, and businesses basically allowed the government to take over their factories and tell them what to produce and all that kinds of stuff, versus their rights to run their companies how they saw fit, kind of thing. Okay, so these guys are just definitions that you can go through that I would recommend that you just check out. Natural rights, remember, life, liberty, property. Most of these we find in the Declaration of Independence. So these key ideas are in the Declaration of Independence for sure. Social contract, the idea of representative government, and the idea that we, the people, have the power and that government should be limited. Basically all you can find there. Other things like grievances were also addressed in the Constitution. So there's a connection between two of our documents. There was taxation without representation. So how do we fix that in the Constitution? Basically, we said all states are represented. Every state gets representatives. Doesn't even matter how small or big. and they set the taxes, basically. The king had absolute power. Now the president does not. And you also have divided power between three branches. You couldn't speak out against government. So we have a First Amendment for that. You had to house troops in your homes. So we have a Third Amendment for that. Or they could go into your homes and take your stuff. So Fourth Amendment. Or that you didn't have, due process or fair trials and that kinds of stuff. So definitely things in the Bill of Rights and the Constitution address the problems that were under the British government. So explain how models of representative democracy are visible in major institutions, policies, events, or debates in the U.S. Okay, so for this, these are those three basically types of democracy. And so participatory, pluralist, or elite. Participatory basically is that we have we emphasize lots of participation and voting and access and chances for people to participate in government. Pluralist is the idea that we have all these competing groups and they compete with each other so that one doesn't become too powerful. They can kind of check each other. And then elite democracy is basically that the rich people are running everything and you really want limited influence from the public and that kind of stuff. And so to be honest, I wouldn't stress too much on these because they did a former FRQ practice where this was basically the crux of it, which I probably will do for you guys. For some of you guys asked for practice FRQ. So yeah, for sure. I will definitely give you some opportunities to do that. So I would not worry too much about this because I do not think it's going to be a feature on this exam since they've already done a question around that and I don't see them repeating that for sure. Okay, so Federalist number 10 and Brutus number 1 basically explain the relationship between the key provisions of the articles and the debate between government power that used to be for the states. Fed 10 is like, hey, chill out. I know you guys are a little worried, but like this is going to be the best, basically. That like the issue is not the federal government. The issue is basically these factions and them taking over and this kinds of stuff. And so he's like, a large republic is actually going to be better. To protect against tyranny and stuff like that, basically. Brutus 1 is he's an anti-federalist and he's basically saying, look, this is a problem. We need state sovereignty. That's the main idea behind his. It's like states should have their own power. They should have their own control. And we should not be we should not allow the federal government to tell states what to do. So he was definitely advocating for that state sovereignty, the power, the control to be with the states and a weak central government. That's what the Anti-Federalist and Brutus was all about. Okay, another enduring understanding. The Constitution emerged from the debate around the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation as a blueprint for limited government. So bad articles led to better Constitution. That's what you got to remember. The articles were bad. There were all these weaknesses. You can click on this video link. I'm not going to click on it because we don't, some of you might not want to watch it, so that's okay. But I would recommend you check that out. Basically goes over what were they and what were the problems with them. The key thing is that they didn't have a central military and they didn't have a tax enforcement power. So articles, again, it was a firm league of friendship. You had a weak national government. You only had a unicameral Congress, so not bicameral like we have now. No executive or judicial branches, so really just the Congress and a weak one at that. Flaws or problems. Congress could not tax, so they could just ask the states, and the states were like, yeah, no. No enforcement. They didn't have a court system or executive branch. No power to regulate or promote trade among the states. So states were like fighting with each other and tariff and taxing each other constantly. And amendments required unanimous approval, so they never amended it. Shays' Rebellion was that catalyst. That was that incident that basically led to a new constitution. Them going this huge rebellion, this outbreak of these farmers. Basically, they were upset that they couldn't losing land because they couldn't pay their debts, and they rebelled. And they ended up quelling the rebellion, but a lot of rich people, especially Madison and Hamilton, were like, "Yeah, this could happen again, and it could be something that we couldn't stop." So let's like build a constitution and build a government that actually can handle like a problem like that, right? And so basically they convinced the leaders that we needed to amend the articles. We need to fix it. Once remember they got there, they were like, forget it. So key things to know about the weaknesses, basically that there were specific instances and challenges that led to those weaknesses represented by the lack of military power. So Shays' Rebellion, no military to stop that. Also, they could not tax. Big problem. If you can't tax, you can't raise revenue, and then you can't do anything. So that can be a problem for sure. Okay, learning objective, constitutional compromises. So this is basically just going over those four key compromises that happened. the Great Compromise, Electoral Compromise, the Three-Fifths, and then also the Slave Trade Compromise. So know that there was negotiation, that there was debate, and that's what led to compromise. So this was not everybody got what they wanted, but they were able to, figure out a plan that worked for everybody, that they were okay enough with. Big one to remember is the Great Compromise, also called the Connecticut Compromise. Basically, because originally they came up with two plans. They were like, the big states, Madison was like, let's have a Virginia plan, based on your population. Sounds good. And then the smaller states, New Jersey was like, oh, we're going to have no representation in Congress. So they're like, yeah, this is not a good plan for us. So basically they were like, let's just do it by states and everybody gets one, that's what they thought was fair. And then Madison and the large states were like, yeah, that's not fair to us though. So basically you had those two plans and then they were fighting it out. And then someone was like, hey, why don't you just put those two together? Oh, cool. So that's why we have that bicameral Congress. That's why we have the Senate, which is for the small states, and then the House of Representatives, so it's by population for the large states. Got two crash course videos in there if you want to check those out to just review that, those compromises on the Great Compromise, especially. Okay, enduring understanding, the Constitution created a competitive policymaking process to ensure the people's will is represented and that freedom is preserved. Basically, understanding checks and balances, check out that video to check that out as well. Remember that separation of powers is the idea that we separated the three branches. And checks and balances is the idea of that these branches have the powers, and so they can then check each other to balance out the power. So they're similar and they're connected, but they're not exactly the same thing. And then I put here, this is kind of funny for me, I know, because I'm a teacher, but this is a check, like an actual deposited check from a bank, and then this is a balance sheet. So remember in econ, we also deal with checks and balances, but it's totally different. Yay, that's the fun of taking gov and econ. Okay. Checks and balances for government is not about finances or money. It's all about basically that we have checks on certain government institutions to stop them from getting too powerful, basically. Okay, so separation of powers is basically that we've got the power separated into the three branches. You've got the legislative, the Congress, they make the laws. You've got the executive, that's the president, he enforces the laws. And then you've got the judicial branch, that's the courts, and they interpret the laws. They tell us what the law means. I always like to tell the students, it's like a baton that's passed. The Congress writes the law, they pass it off to the president, he enforces it, make sure people actually follow it. And then if people want to challenge it, or if they don't think the president's enforcing it properly, or if the law might be unconstitutional, then the court can go ahead and take a look and rule on that. So crash course on there if you want to check that out. Good one for sure. Checks and balances, again, is that so we did separate the power. And it's really, really smart. I mean, every time I read the Constitution, I'm always so amazed when I'm like, wow, they really thought of almost everything. As far as what if this? It's like someone was in the room and they were like, well, what if this happened? They're like, all right, fine, put that in there. Well, what if this happened? Okay, fine, give the president that power. Well, what if the president vetoed a law that, limited his power, but it was a really good law that everybody liked except for him? Okay, override. This is basically Congress creating all these sorts of different parts of the Constitution that goes, okay, so if this happens, then don't worry because this will, we can stop this. So if the, president tries to do this, we can just, take away the funding for this or something like that, right? So examples, we should know all of them. There's a chart where you can see all of them, but examples would be the important thing to remember about a check and balance is that it's one branch checking another, not something within the branch. It's got to be like the president stopping Congress from doing something, Congress stopping the courts from doing something, or the courts ruling a congressional law unconstitutional kind of thing. Okay. Oh, there's the chart right there. So checks and balances, again, this is just knowing what can the, executive, legislative, and judicial branch do. We'll go into more depth and detail on that when we go into those branches specifically in Unit 2, but there they are right there. So you can just get an overview again. Have that in one spot. It's really good thing as well. Okay, so that's just definitions again of those. I think it did a pretty good job of explaining that. And remember, Fed 51 basically just explains these two things. Basically explains separation of powers, why they separated it, and then also explains the checks and balances and how they're going to be a good, effective system. Okay, limitations on majority rule. Basically, the problems of excessive democracy. This is what Madison talked about in Fed 10. Two wolves in a sheep voting on what's for dinner. It's not good to give the majority total power because they could take away rights from the minority, basically. Ways the Constitution can limit majority rule. We have an insulated Senate, so the Senate is somewhat protected because they have those 6-year terms. Protected from swings of the majorities and stuff like that. Also, they have staggered terms. Our judiciary is independent, and then we also indirectly elect our president. So those are ways that we have tried to limit majority rule, basically. Okay, explain how Federalist and Anti-Federalist views on central government and democracy are reflected in a U.S. foundational documents. So Anti-Federalists, again, basically were like, hey, strong central government, and they warned about basically weren't against the danger. Oh yeah, they weren't. Sorry, I'm reading that right now. They weren't against the dangers to personal liberty. They were like, don't worry, you're still going to have liberty, you're still going to have freedom. It's just this is going to be better protection for us, basically. So they were against ratification, and they demanded a Bill of Rights to protect individual liberties. So the Federalists, they were the ones who were like stronger national governments and weaker state governments. So they wanted the new Constitution, and they wrote the Federalist Papers to basically defend that. Okay. Is a Bill of Rights necessary to protect individual liberties? Just two arguments. The Federalists are like, we don't really need it. The Anti-Federalists are like, yeah, you kind of do. So this is basically the two sides of why we maybe should have a Bill of Rights and why maybe we don't need it that much. Even though I consider myself a Federalist and I agree with most of what they believe, I do agree with the Anti-Federalists on this one. I think it is necessary to have a Bill of Rights, to put that, codify it in writing, say this is what you can't do. I think it's very essential for limited government, for sure. Okay. So, hey, there's a rap for that. Straight out of Philly. Ooh, and I've recorded this one too, so you can check that out. To watch my rap and just reviews, all the key stuff, all about that compromises and what came out of the convention. Article 5 is all about changing the Constitution, amendment proposal process. So remember that you have to propose an amendment. That takes 2/3 of Congress. Then you need to ratify the amendment, and that takes 3/4 of the states. So it is a very high bar to amend the Constitution. It's not something that happens often, only 27 times in our history, but it is possible for sure. Okay. We can do it informally. Congress passes laws that changes their interpretations of powers. The president has done things that go beyond maybe what the Constitution says he can do, and executive agreements he makes and that kinds of stuff. Judicial decisions, like judicial review, is not in the Constitution. So that's like an informal development. And then, political party practices, that kind of stuff is in the Constitution as well. Okay, we're almost done. What is federalism? It's division of power between national and state governments. Key idea. You need to know it. Enduring understanding is that it reflects the dynamic distribution of power between national and state governments. So it's a distribution, not a separation. I'm very careful. It's a distribution of power between the states and the federal government. Great crash course you can check out on there. All of these learning objectives sound super similar because they just really want you to understand like how federalism is in action, basically. So how are societal needs affected by the way that we distribute power? What's the appropriate balance of power, and how has that changed or evolved over time? And how does that affect the policymaking process, basically? Okay, so remember we did the Venn diagrams. This is just a visual of that, so you can see. Okay, remember the states have certain powers, the national government has certain powers, and they have certain powers that they share together. Those concurrent powers. The reserve powers come out of the 10th Amendment of the Constitution, and the national government powers mostly come out of the Article 1 of the Constitution. Those enumerated powers. So the express enumerated delegated powers, again, those are specifically listed in Article 1, Section 8. Implied powers, not specifically there, but, implied through the necessary and proper clause. Inherent powers are just the powers that of just an independent state. Reserve powers that the individual states have. Concurrent powers, ones that they share. And then prohibited powers, there's also things that we said you can't do. Things that they're not allowed, like states are not allowed to enter into treaties, for example. That's a prohibited power. Okay, so I love this just little visual because this is showing like Uncle Sam, which is supposed to represent the federal government, and how we kind of put him in a box and how we limited government. So this just basically says shares power between him and the states. His power is limited because of the people's rights. Each branch can limit the actions of others. His power is divided among 3 branches. So just basically it goes through and just kind of explains how we boxed in the federal government and limited their power and their authority. Okay, federal spending and mandates. Federal revenue sharing was basically the old system where the federal government used to actually share revenue and share tax earnings with the states. A mandate is basically a rule that the federal government puts on the states. So it says you have to do this, or you're breaking the law, basically, you're breaking federal law. And states usually don't like mandates because they're being told what to do. You could have an unfunded mandate they really don't like because then that's basically you're not paying for it. Categorical grants and block grants. Remember, categoricals are for a specific purpose, and block grants are for the broad purpose, the over general thing, like this is just for healthcare or this is just for education, that kinds of things, basically. So key thing to remember the difference between those. Supreme Court cases for Unit 1, McCulloch v. Maryland and U.S. v. Lopez. And then also Marbury versus Madison. So McCulloch v. Maryland, remember in that case, the case established supremacy of the U.S. Constitution and federal laws over state laws. The U.S. established a federal bank in Maryland. Maryland tried to tax the bank, and McCulloch was his federal employee. He's like, I'm not going to pay the tax. What did the federal government rule? They basically said, well, two things. They said, yes, the U.S. can create a bank, but then also more importantly, that you cannot tax the Bank Maryland, that the federal government has authority over the states because of the supremacy clause. Okay, U.S. v. Lopez, this came much later, but it's also related because it's another case that relates to federalism. This was the Congress tried to pass a Gun-Free School Zones Act, a federal law saying no guns in schools within like 150 feet. And there was this kid, Lopez, who brought a gun to school. He was charged under federal law. And his lawyer was like, I don't think that federal law should exist because that seems like a state power, not a federal power. So the Supreme Court agreed with Lopez and his lawyer. And so they said Congress may not use the Commerce Clause to make possession of a gun in a school zone a federal crime. Because Congress said, well, it was commerce. Business is why we're allowed to pass this law related to guns. Because remember, they have like enumerated powers like this. You can pass laws on the post office and on weights and measures and you can declare war and that kinds of stuff. So like nothing with guns, nothing with schools in the Constitution. So why do they get to do that? And the Supreme Court's like, yeah, they shouldn't. So what does that mean? That means states can pass a law. Like we have state laws that say you can't bring guns to schools, but the federal government is allowed to, basically. Okay, and then Marbury versus Madison, we also see this appear in Unit 2 as well. But remember, this is just the case that established judicial review, which allows the Supreme Court to nullify or basically X out or get rid of an act, a legislative act, an act of the executive branch, if it violates the Constitution specifically. Okay, and that is it for Unit 1. So I'm going to say goodbye on this video. I love you all. I'm sorry I don't even know how long this was, but I hope you found it helpful. And we will continue Unit 2 soon to begin.